Welcome and good morning to each one of you for our morning devotion. It is indeed a God-given opportunity for us to meet as we seek our loving God for His special messages for us. God, who always intends the very best for us, He knows what we, His children, need, and in His love, He has shown us the way that we ought to go and how we ought to relate to people in this world, and what should be our example, what should be our relationship with the world and with God. We will continue our study in the book of Proverbs in chapter 26. We are going to look at verses 11 and 12. Proverbs 26, chapter 26, verse 11 and 12, reading from the word, verse 11, as a dog returns to his own vomit, so a fool repeats his folly. Verse 12, do you see a man wise in his own eyes? There is more hope for a fool than for him. We, in these two verses, are continuing to learn and understand the nature of a fool. In these verses from 7 onwards, the wise man describes the fool in various terms as a lame person who could not do much, as like a stone that is bound in a sling, which would only repeat to hurt the slinger, or like a thorn that is struck into the hands of a drunkard, not realizing that there is a thorn because he lost his senses to discern a thorn in his hand. Then we talked about how God will grant these people their reward, their punishment, as it were, their wages. And today we end with these two verses where we see once more God telling them how in our relationship with these groups of people that we should be very careful in using these repulsive images. The wise man is very forcefully telling us what is the plight of these foolish people, their foolish pattern of thinking and life. In the first verse, we see a foolish person and his behavior illustrated by a dog which would return to its vomit, to show how a foolish person, stubborn, repeats harmful mistakes or sins of his foolishness, despite he knowing what is better to do. When others try to teach him, he would resist and would use no opportunities to learn and grow. So is the experience of a foolish person who, like a dog, and we know and have seen dogs. Okay, for many of us, dogs may be very loving pets at home, but they do exhibit certain characteristics which are very repulsive to us. Just like how A dog, because of its foolishness, I suppose, that if it should eat things which are destructive for itself, which cause in their stomachs a repulsion of food that they have eaten, a dog would vomit. So a dog, after it brought forth what it ate, it would stay for a while, and then it almost seems like it is the nature of a dog to return back to its vomit. It would go sniff at it, it would lick at it, and deplorably, finally, it will eat it. Something at one point in time was repulsive to a dog, but now it returns back to take it. But this, in a way, tells us, just like a dog's nature to return to its vomit, so is the fool's nature to repeat his foolishness. A fool will not change his ways, though he knows the consequences. But as we might see a dog doing this irrational, unthinkable act of eating its vomit, so likewise a fool's nature is to repeat his folly. As Apostle Peter in second epistle of Peter, chapter 2, verse 22, but it has happened to them according to the true proverb. Peter has observed these foolish people at work, the way how they behave, how they continue to commit wrongs and mistakes that they have been made known, they realize that they are wrong, but still in their foolishness they would return back. And Peter is quoting this proverb: a dog returns to its vomit, and a sow, having washed to her, wallowing in the mire. A pig, a swine, washing it up to see its beautiful red color, but the nature of a pig is to return back to the mire. However, you may love that pig for its beauty, for its color, and you think it would be a good pet, and you can go and wash it up nicely, give a good bath, and hold it in your hand, it may look good. But once you pass by a place where there is mire, dirt, and there the pig would jump out of your hands and to go and wallow in this mire, in this dirt. By nature, a pig has attraction to this dirty environment where it would love to wallow and to rest and to enjoy itself. This is how sometimes we see how foolish human beings can be, and especially people who do not have the ability to learn from their errors. They constantly return to behaviors or ideas that are known to be destructive, just like how a dog would return to its vomit. That is how we see a fool intentionally shocking us to highlight his experience of not learning from mistakes, but he defeats himself, and by his nature of persistence and foolishness to remain in sin. What a terrible situation it is to find a person in this condition. For a fool who do not, fools who do not learn lessons from their daily experience, those who cannot see the operation of this principle that we have learned in earlier Proverbs. A wise person learns from observation and even including their own failures. A wise person sees where they fall, the consequences that they experience because of a wrong reason. And so they would learn never to let this principle of cause and effect, what is the cause for their downfall, they would find out. And so a wise man would keep away from such. This is a foolish person acts because he lacks godly wisdom and sense. He acts in this manner to suffer more than they have ever even learned a lesson. Actions certainly lead to consequences, science tells us, and we have seen the Proverbs warning us about this. But a fool repeats exactly the same mistakes over and over again. And so, if the wise man used this repulsive illustration, we can understand how terrible it is, the condition of a fool who will learn nothing even from instructions given to him or what experience teaches him, learning lessons from mistakes that we have made and never to repeat it. A fool, by doing these very things that harm him, and it can surely lead him repeatedly doing such actions without much thinking and not learning your lessons, you may even become an addict. You may become dependent and even more harder to overcome. So you see here the condition of a fool who learns nothing from experience, how hard it is for him to overcome a situation. No wonder Apostle Peter, talking to early Christians, tells them of such kind of behavior that we observe in people who are foolish. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 21 and 22. For it would have been better for them never to know the way of righteousness than after knowing it, turn back from the holy commandment delivered to them. When you preach to a fool, when you teach to him the word of God and show them the importance of keeping the holy commandments, these foolish people, knowing that it is God's holy word, his holy commandments that is spoken to them, they will turn back. And so Peter says, it is better that they have not learned the way of righteousness. For learning has done no good for them because they only turn back from their wrongdoing. Likewise, what would happen to a dog which eats its own vomit, or a pig, even after it is cleaned, would go back to its dirt and mire to wallow there? Somehow we as human beings we take comfort or we take certain amount of ease when we find ourselves in such similar pitiable conditions. We seem to be enjoying sin, though it is against God's word. We do not heed God's Holy Spirit speaking to our conscience. When we are deliberately directed towards God and His holy law, we many times do not stop the bad behavior that we have been accustomed to, this bad, sinful nature and sin that we enjoy very much. Certainly, this world is filled with evil, polluted with wickedness, and sin is rampant. But there are so many of us who may appear to be on the side of God, but in our own spiritual lives, we may be behaving like a foolish person or like a dog or a pig who do not realize the need for seeing the wrong consequences. Instead of turning to God, we remain in sin. The lesson comes to us, calling us to a self-awareness. We are called not to be in the world to follow it and its practices, but to a strong call for introspection. God is urging us to recognize the kind of life that we are living, to understand the consequences of our actions, that we, with no escape, do experience the consequences of our actions. But somehow we are not able to free ourselves from this cycle of self-sabotage. We are trying never to be released, but comfortable with remaining in this cycle. Thus, we are only bringing destruction upon ourselves. How terrible it can be that when we spiritually constantly relapse to our own sinful condition, rather than falling back into the hands of God, who alone is able to save us from the pollution and the sin of this world. A very serious lesson that the wise man is teaching us today, that we do not remain in sin, but as God promised us, to those who confess their sins, He is faithful and just to forgive us and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. But when we go to the next verse, we will see something even more severe. If you are a human being who think you're wise in your own eyes, no wonder human beings are wise, because they were created with a power that God has given to them. God gave them, created them in His own image and likeness, with powers like God, to think, to reason, and to make choices and decisions on our own accord. But with these great powers that God has given to us, human beings still are not using these God-given abilities to acknowledge God, to turn to Him when we fail, and to seek His forgiveness His constant protection and guidance to keep us on this path of righteousness. But here is a person who the wise man calls a fool. But here is a person who is even in a more dangerous and critical condition even than a sin, even than a fool, and that is one who is wise in his own eyes. And Solomon has used this expression, and we have seen people who tend to be wise in their own eyes. In these Proverbs, the wise man has reminded and constantly advised the wise man of the serious consequences and severe treatment he would receive because of his own foolish behavior. But now Solomon talks about a person who is even in a worse danger, and that is a proud person. A proud person is one who is wise in his own eyes. This is a kind of foolishness that they can never learn from the wisdom of heaven. As somebody said, Morgan has said, the greatest fool is a fool who does not know that he is a fool. How terrible. On the contrary, they think, though they are foolish, that they know all things, and nobody knows greater and more than them. But what the reality is a fool is a fool who does not know that he is a fool. This danger may look very subtle. A person who does not know what his true condition is, somebody who cannot evaluate themselves. People who do not feel the need to know God. People who ignore knowledge, who do not trust in the divine power. Thus, they are deprived of divine wisdom from God. What a pitiable condition. Somebody who is proud, who only thinks of himself. How terrible it can be when you see such people who get caught in their own ignorance and who do not make any attempts to change their lives. Instead of seeking help from God, they avoid returning back to Him, and they think it is foolishness because of their pride and ego, which would not drive them to God, but rather it drives them back to sin and their evil ways. How foolish it can be, and the condition of such a person who does not see what his true self and condition is. Pride is the root cause, as we know in the Bible, the cause for all trouble and destruction. Solomon, in these Proverbs, have repeatedly warned us and informed us that we should never go around with that inflated ego, comparing themselves to be great and extraordinary, but rejecting God's truth and wisdom. And for such people, The wise man says, there is no hope for a fool. The fall of Lucifer, we know in heaven, was really pride. That exalted position as the covering cherub, the leader of the angelic hosts, Lucifer, though a created being as an angel, was endowed with special gifts and abilities. But all of these, which were to be used in service and honor to God, Lucifer let pride well up in his heart. He began even to desire the position of Jesus Christ and exalted himself even above the throne of God. If you hear him speak in Isaiah 14, Ezekiel 28, you could hear him talk about himself, I, and I. He seems to be suffering with this I problem or ego or pride. And consequently, when he could not contain himself, rebelled against God, and even was capable of influencing a third of angels. That is how charismatic he was. That is how influential he was. And that is what we see happening in the world. Many of these worldly leaders are so influential, so charismatic, that they can draw people simply by their words and their promises. And we know our politicians who are so skilled in this manner. But we know the reality, their actions would never keep their promise. Lucifer fell in rebellion and was in that war against God, was defeated, and he had no more place with God. For he chose to keep himself away from God's presence, and consequently he becomes the enemy of God, Satan. Apostle James is warning us, telling us about and quoting this proverb in chapter 3, verse 34 of Proverbs. James tells us in chapter 4, verse 6, but he gives more grace. Therefore it says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. This is a proverb that James quotes from chapter 3 of Proverbs. God is always gracious. He is loving. He is tender-hearted towards his people. But God opposes those who are proud. But to those who are humble, he gives them grace so that they could rise and fall back into the hands of God. And he is ever willing to accept them. Jesus illustrated this so beautifully in that parable, even maybe a true parable it is, of two people who went to pray in the temple. One was a Pharisee, another was a publican or a sinner. A Pharisee who boasted in his prayer about himself, enumerating all the great and good things, and how careful he was even to pay tithe upon the smallest leaf in his garden. He thought that he would, by his impressive way of following his rituals and keeping his laws, but in his relationships with his fellow human beings, seeing that poor sinner who felt himself so unworthy to be in God's presence, who stays even almost on the outer parts of the temple precinct, he who despises himself beats his chest and seeks God's pardon with penitent, repentant heart, acknowledging that he is a sinner. But here is this Pharisee who boasts of being superior to this despised tax collector or a sinner. Self-exaltation and pride was certainly noticed by Jesus. And at the end of this parable, even without these worshippers realizing that Jesus watched them, Jesus knew their experiences. The tax collector or the sinner went home free, satisfied, having obtained mercy because he was humble and repentant in God's presence. And he went home happily, never bothered with all those rumbling talk of the Pharisee. But Jesus said, God rejects such Pharisees' prayer. People who point their finger at others, trying to make themselves more holy by referring to others who are, in their sight, more sinful. But in God's presence, who knows the heart, God sees what is in the heart of a repentant sinner, and God gives him his grace and mercy. And there he is, one who has received forgiveness. And he was more justified in God's presence than even a Pharisee whose prayer was outright denied. What a pitiable condition that we see when people who are in their own eyes, who think that they are far better than somebody else, finally they come to know that in God's sight they are really of no value, not having experienced God's great love. We should always be cautious about and be always aware of our true condition, recognizing our sinfulness and ever willing to receive pardon from God. We should avoid this temptation that the enemy brings to us to boost our ego and our pride. He tries to exalt us, and we, like sinful human beings, we climb the drumstick tree, as we say in our language. You climb a drumstick tree, sure enough, the tree branch cannot bear your weight and it would break. Certainly, fall is the result of such pride and ego that any human being cherishes in their heart. We are called upon to cultivate Christ-like behavior. Christ was willing to humble himself, who was God himself in heaven, became a sinner like a sinful human being, lived in the lowliest of human experiences, experiencing poverty, and yet Christ never sinned because he was one who constantly depended upon his Father. There are great lessons that we need to learn from these two wonderful proverbs that the wise man is teaching us today. We are called upon to be wise so that we will not be those who return back to the same mistake that we make. Once you make a mistake, you learn lessons from there, never to burn your finger a second time. But it needs a lot of courage and a lot of fortitude to let God take control of our lives so that he could keep us away from the evil that we have at one time suffered. return to God, and He will return to you. And He will, as He promised, to cleanse you from all righteousness and make you pure and holy. And never let pride or ego come into your heart. Never see that you are greater and better than the others, but always willing to humble and to let God's will be done and His guidance to lead us in this path of righteousness. What a blessed privilege it is ours as we hear these words to let God's power change and transform us to be those who are humble and those who would learn lessons from their lives' failures. May God bless each one of us today as we go about our daily duties and be blessed by the word of God.